The silence that followed Mrs. Bennet's scream lasted only a moment before pandemonium erupted. Teacups clattered to the floor. Several of the older women gasped in unison. Eleanor Hartwell's face drained of all color, and she swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the refreshment table for support. Young Dr. Michael Chapman, who had been browsing the medical history section, rushed forward immediately, kneeling beside Victor's prone form. His professional assessment was swift and grimly conclusive. "He's been dead for at least 30 minutes, Dr. Chapman announced, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "The body temperature suggests the attack occurred sometime between 2 and 2:30. Inspector William Thornton arrived within 20 minutes, a competent, if rather methodical man who had served as Thornfield's police inspector for 12 years. He was accompanied by Sergeant Matthews, a younger officer with sharp eyes and an unfortunate tendency toward jumping to conclusions. They cordoned off the office with practiced efficiency, though Miss Marple noted that neither man seemed particularly experienced with a crime scene of this magnitude. Thornfield's most serious incident in recent memory had been the theft of Mrs. Pemberton's prize-winning roses. "Everyone must remain in the library," Inspector Thornton announced, his authoritative tone doing little to calm the nervous chatter that had resumed among the assembled crowd. "No one leaves until we have taken statements from each of you." Eleanor sat rigidly in one of the reading room chairs, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. Miss Marple, positioning herself nearby with deliberate casualness, observed the minute trembling in Eleanor's fingers and the peculiar steadiness of her breathing, the sort of controlled respiration that suggested practice in suppressing emotion. Fear, certainly, but also something else, relief, perhaps, or resignation. Dorothy Ashworth stood near the window, her substantial frame silhouetted against the autumn light. Beside her, James Collingwood maintained a protective proximity, his hand hovering near, but not quite touching, the small of her back. When Dorothy caught Miss Marple watching them, she turned away sharply, but not before Miss Marple detected something like defiance in her expression. The second Mrs. Ashworth, Margaret, a woman of perhaps 45 with the anxious demeanor of someone perpetually uncertain of her social standing, had positioned herself as far from the others as possible, sitting alone near the poetry section. She twisted a handkerchief between her hands, her lips moving silently as though she were rehearsing some explanation that might never be required. "The letter opener," Inspector Thornton said to Sergeant Matthews, his voice carrying the weight of someone stating the obvious. "We'll need to identify its origin. It appears to be quite distinctive." Before Matthews could respond, Eleanor spoke for the first time since Victor's body had been discovered. Her voice emerged quietly, almost hoarsely. "It belonged to the Ashworth estate. It was in this morning's donation. An 18th-century Italian piece, I believe. Quite valuable." Miss Marple watched as Dorothy Ashworth's jaw tightened perceptibly at this revelation. James Collingwood's hand finally made contact with Dorothy's back, a steadying gesture, or perhaps a warning. Curious, Inspector Thornton mused, that he should be killed with a weapon from his own family collection. One might almost suspect a personal element to the crime. The word almost hung in the air like a bell that had been struck and left to fade slowly. Almost, as though the inspector himself recognized the convenient obviousness of the scenario before them. Sergeant Matthews leaned toward his superior and whispered something Miss Marple could not quite hear. Inspector Thornton's expression shifted into one of grim certainty. He straightened and addressed the room once more. "We will begin taking statements. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, as the victim's wife, you will be our first interview." Eleanor rose with the mechanical movements of an automaton. As she passed Miss Marple's chair, their eyes met for the briefest instant. In that fraction of a second, Miss Marple perceived something she would have found remarkable had she not spent a lifetime recognizing the thousand subtle variations of human guilt. Eleanor was frightened. Yes, But her fear was not the fear of someone who had committed murder. It was something far more complex, the fear of someone whose world had been irrevocably shattered by an act they had not performed. Miss Marple turned her attention to the place where Victor's body had lain. The office door remained open, and she could see the edge of the Persian rug, now marked with a chalk outline. Dr. Chapman stood nearby, speaking quietly with Inspector Thornton about the angle of the wound and the considerable force required to drive the letter opener so deeply between the ribs. Remarkable force, Miss Marple thought. Considerable rage or extraordinary desperation. Not the work of a tentative hand, nor the action of someone merely defending themselves. This had been deliberate, calculated, almost one might say, prepared. She returned to her cup of Earl Grey, now thoroughly cold, and reflected upon the marked page in Tennyson that still lay upon the display table, its mysterious underlined passage still visible to anyone who cared to examine it. In the margin of the night, the coldest words are written. Someone had wanted her to find that passage, or perhaps someone had left it there entirely by accident. Either way, Miss Marple felt certain that somewhere within this village, a truth far darker than a simple murder was waiting to be discovered. Eleanor's interview lasted 45 minutes. When she emerged from the office, her face was even paler than before, and her composure had begun to crack at the edges. She was instructed to sit apart from the others, and Sergeant Matthews positioned himself nearby with the air of a man guarding a particularly valuable piece of evidence. Miss Marple noted that Eleanor made no attempt to speak to anyone, nor did she look in the direction of the office where her husband's body still lay. Inspector Thornton called upon James Collingwood next. The solicitor rose with the measured movements of a man accustomed to courtrooms and legal proceedings. He straightened his waistcoat, adjusted his tie with meticulous precision, and entered the office with the confidence of someone who believed himself to be above suspicion. Miss Marple observed that Dorothy Ashworth watched him go with an expression of such naked anxiety that it was almost painful to witness. She gripped the arm of her chair so tightly that her knuckles blanched white. "Dreadful business," Mrs. Bennet whispered from her seat nearby. The baker had remained in the library, despite having no official reason to do so. Inspector Thornton had merely asked her to remain available should questions arise. Poor Eleanor. Though I must say I'm not entirely surprised. Victor Hartwell was not a pleasant man. Everyone in the village knew he was terribly controlling with that wife of his. Miss Marple turned to regard Mrs. Bennet with mild interest. "You knew him well, then?" "Well enough," Mrs. Bennet replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "My nephew works at the bank, you see. He mentioned that Victor was quite strict about the accounts. Accused people of dishonesty at the slightest discrepancy. A man like that makes enemies, Miss Marple. Enemies indeed." Before Miss Marple could respond, Margaret Ashworth rose suddenly and approached the nearest shelf of books, her movements agitated and purposeless. She pulled volumes at random, examined them with unseeing eyes, and replaced them. It was the behavior of someone desperate to appear occupied, to suggest innocence through activity. Miss Marple recognized it immediately. She had seen it countless times before, in the village of St. Mary Mead, in the drawing rooms of Surrey estates, in the lives of ordinary people confronted with extraordinary circumstances. When James Collingwood emerged from his interview nearly an hour later, his confidence had been noticeably diminished. His collar appeared suddenly too tight, and a thin sheen of perspiration glistened on his forehead despite the cool autumn air drifting through the library windows. Dorothy Ashworth rose instinctively, as though to comfort him, but caught herself and resumed her seat with elaborate casualness that fooled no one. "Mrs. Dorothy Ashworth," Inspector Thornton called out, consulting his notebook. Dorothy rose with the bearing of someone ascending a scaffold. She was a tall woman, broader through the shoulders than most, with the robust constitution of someone accustomed to country, living, and physical labor. She did not look at James Collingwood as she passed him. She did not acknowledge the worried glances cast in her direction by Margaret Ashworth. She simply walked into the office, with her head held high, and the door closed behind her with a decisive click. The library fell into an uneasy quietude. The afternoon light had begun to shift, taking on that particular golden quality that preceded dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 4 o'clock, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the curious way that time seemed to expand during moments of crisis. What had occurred was perhaps 90 minutes ago. Victor's death, Eleanor's scream, the arrival of the police. Yet it felt as though half a day had passed. Sergeant Matthews approached Miss Marple with the slightly awkward deference that younger men often displayed toward elderly women of her station. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might have seen anything unusual this morning or early afternoon, before the incident occurred." "I saw a great many things," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "The question is whether any of them were truly unusual or merely different from the quotidian rhythm of village life. Thornfield is such a peaceful place, you understand. When something genuinely extraordinary occurs, it tends to be preceded by countless small irregularities that we dismiss as insignificant." Sergeant Matthews looked somewhat perplexed by this response. "Could you perhaps elaborate?" "I noticed that Mrs. Eleanor seemed distressed when her husband arrived," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. "There was an argument in the office, quite heated from what little I could discern. I also observed that the Tennyson collection contained an oddly marked volume, though I cannot say with certainty whether this had any bearing on subsequent events. And I noted that young Mrs. Margaret Ashworth seemed unusually anxious today, more so than one might expect from a widow of merely 3 months' duration. And Mr. Collingwood," Sergeant Matthews pressed. "Mr. Collingwood wore the expression of a man concealing something," Miss Marple said carefully, "though whether that something pertains to the matter at hand or to some entirely separate concern, I could not presume to judge." Dorothy Ashworth emerged from the office precisely 40 minutes later, her composure intact, but her eyes suspiciously bright, as though she had been fighting back tears. She sat rigidly in her chair, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. Inspector Thornton made a notation in his book and looked up. "Miss Marple, I believe we shall require your statement as well." Miss Marple rose with deliberate slowness, allowing her knees a moment to adjust to bearing her weight. She had learned long ago that the simple act of moving carefully through a room communicated humility and harmlessness, qualities that encouraged others to speak more freely in her presence. Inspector Thornton held the office door open for her with perfunctory courtesy, and she entered the space where Victor Hartwell had met his violent end. The body had been removed, but the chalk outline remained on the Persian rug like a grotesque shadow. The letter opener was gone as well, presumably catalogued as evidence. The office itself was sparse and utilitarian, a desk of dark wood, filing cabinets, 2 chairs positioned across from one another in the manner designed to facilitate difficult conversations. Miss Marple settled into the chair offered to her and folded her hands in her lap, the picture of cooperative serenity. "I understand you arrived quite early this morning," Inspector Thornton began, consulting his notes, "before the fair officially opened." "Indeed," Miss Marple confirmed. "I find that early arrival allows for a more thorough examination of the donated materials without the distraction of conversation. At my age, one learns to value quiet contemplation." "And you observed nothing unusual during those early hours?" Miss Marple considered the question with genuine deliberation. "I observed Eleanor arranging the books with considerable care. She seemed pleased with the organization, though somewhat preoccupied." Victor Hartwell arrived approximately 11:30 in a state of agitation. He and Eleanor engaged in a brief but heated discussion in this very office. Their voices were raised, though I could not discern the specific content of their disagreement. Inspector Thornton's pen moved across the page. "Did you happen to hear what they were arguing about?" "Only fragments," Miss Marple said. "Something regarding money, I believe." "And permission?" Victor seemed to believe that Eleanor had done something she had no authority to do. I see. The inspector looked up. And after this argument, Victor departed. Eleanor emerged somewhat upset but composed herself when the other guests began to arrive. The morning proceeded normally until the discovery of the body. Inspector Thornton leaned back in his chair, studying Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he was attempting to determine whether she was being entirely forthcoming. "You are quite observant for a woman of your age, Miss Marple. I've always found that observation is one of the few advantages of reaching advanced years," she replied mildly. "One accumulates experience in human behavior. Patterns become recognizable. Deviations from pattern become conspicuous." "And what patterns do you observe in this particular situation?" Miss Marple's eyes grew distant. "I observe that several people in this library today are concealing something. Whether their concealment relates to Mr. Hartwell's death or to some entirely separate matter is, at present, unclear to me. I also observe that the murder weapon was taken from a donation made by the Ashworth family, which suggests either careful planning or remarkable coincidence. In my experience, remarkable coincidences are far rarer than they initially appear. You believe one of the Ashworths is responsible." "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that nothing in this situation is as straightforward as it initially appears. The obvious suspect, a wife in conflict with her husband, is often the least likely perpetrator. Murderers of Victor Hartwell's type typically fall victim to their own patterns. They antagonize people systematically, creating multiple grievances. When they are killed, suspicion disperses across a wide field of potential motives." Inspector Thornton set down his pen. "You seem to have considerable experience with murder, Miss Marple." "I have lived a long life in a small village," she replied. One observes. She was dismissed shortly thereafter, though not before she observed that Inspector Thornton's expression had shifted into something resembling uncertainty. He had arrived at the library expecting a straightforward case, a crime of passion involving a quarrelsome married couple. Miss Marple's measured observations had introduced complications he had not anticipated. As she returned to the reading room, she noticed that Margaret Ashworth had been called in for questioning. The younger woman rose from her chair with trembling movements, her handkerchief now shredded into fragments scattered across her lap. She passed Miss Marple without making eye contact, though her shoulders were braced as though preparing for a physical blow. Eleanor sat with her eyes closed, her head tilted back against the chair. She opened them as Miss Marple passed, and in that brief moment of connection, something unspoken passed between them. Eleanor's expression conveyed a question that had no spoken answer, a plea for understanding that transcended the immediate circumstances of Victor's death. Dorothy Ashworth and James Collingwood maintained careful distance from one another, yet Miss Marple detected a tension in the space between them, as though invisible threads of consequence and obligation held them at precise remove. Whatever secrets existed between those two individuals ran deep indeed, rooted in something far more substantial than casual acquaintance. The library clock chimed 5 o'clock. Outside, the autumn sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Inside, under the fluorescent glow of modern electric lights, 7 people sat in uneasy proximity, each harboring their own particular truth, their own specific knowledge of Victor Hartwell's final hours. Miss Marple retrieved her knitting from her bag and settled back into her chair, needles clicking softly as she resumed a half-finished cardigan. To the casual observer, she appeared to be a harmless elderly woman passing the time. No one noticed that her eyes, though seemingly focused on her work, actually tracked every movement, every nervous gesture, every meaningful glance exchanged in that room filled with secrets. Margaret Ashworth's interview concluded just as the library's wall clock struck 5:30. She emerged looking considerably worse than when she had entered, her face blotchy from crying, her composure entirely abandoned. She made directly for a chair in the far corner and sat with her face buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling with what might have been sobs or merely the after-effects of intense fear. No one made any move to comfort her, which Miss Marple found rather telling. In her experience, the guilty often found themselves socially isolated not through deliberate ostracism, but through the instinctive withdrawal of those around them, as though criminality were somehow contagious. Inspector Thornton emerged from the office and addressed the assembled group with visible weariness. "We have completed preliminary interviews. However, several matters require clarification. I must ask that all of you remain in Thornfield for the next 48 hours. No one is to leave the village without explicit permission." "Surely you don't believe one of us is responsible?" Dorothy Ashworth protested, her voice carrying an edge of indignation that barely masked deeper anxiety. "This is preposterous. Victor was killed by some passing vagrant, some criminal drawn by the promise of robbery." "There is no evidence of robbery," Inspector Thornton replied flatly. "The victim's wallet remained in his pocket. His watch, quite valuable according to Dr. Chapman, was still on his wrist. The only item that appears to have been disturbed is the letter opener itself." "Then perhaps it was an accident," James Collingwood suggested, his solicitor's mind already constructing alternative narratives. "An argument that escalated beyond anyone's intention. A weapon seized in the heat of passion." Inspector Thornton did not respond directly to this hypothesis. Instead, he turned to Sergeant Matthews. "I want this library locked and sealed until morning. No one is to remove anything. We will conduct a thorough search of the premises at first light." Miss Marple observed that Eleanor's hands clenched at this announcement. A muscle tightened in her jaw, and she looked away toward the window where darkness had begun to gather. Whatever Eleanor Hartwell knew, and Miss Marple had become increasingly certain that Eleanor knew something significant, remained locked behind her composed facade. By 6 o'clock, Inspector Thornton had arranged for constables to escort each person to their residence. Eleanor was taken to the small cottage she and Victor occupied on Willow Lane, a house that had been in his family for 3 generations. Dorothy Ashworth was accompanied to Ashworth Manor, the sprawling country estate that had been the seat of her late husband's family for centuries. James Collingwood walked with her, maintaining an appropriate distance but somehow conveying the impression that he would have preferred a closer proximity. Margaret Ashworth was taken to the vicarage, where the Reverend and Mrs. Blackwood had offered her temporary accommodation following Gerald Ashworth's death. Her own small house in London had been sold as part of the estate settlement, leaving her in an awkward state of transience, belonging neither to her late husband's world nor to her own previous existence. Mrs. Bennet was escorted to her bakery on High Street. She protested volubly about the disruption to her morning preparations, insisting that she had orders for fresh bread to be ready by dawn. Inspector Thornton, displaying an unexpected pragmatism, allowed her to return home on the condition that she remain available for further questioning if required. Dr. Chapman, having offered his professional assessment, was released to his practice. He departed with obvious relief, though not before Miss Marple observed him exchanging a meaningful glance with Eleanor, a glance that contained something beyond professional courtesy. Something that suggested a deeper connection than the casual acquaintance one might expect between a physician and a patient. By 6:30, only Miss Marple remained in the library with Inspector Thornton and Sergeant Matthews. The inspector seemed reluctant to dismiss her, as though recognizing that her observations, however delicately expressed, possessed a quality of penetrating insight that his own investigation might benefit from. "You possess considerable insight into human nature, Miss Marple," he said finally. "In your estimation, who among those individuals is most likely to have committed this crime?" Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. "Inspector, I've learned that the most obvious suspect is frequently the least guilty. Eleanor Hartwell clearly harbored resentment toward her husband, yet her fear this evening was not the fear of one who has committed murder. It is a different quality of fear altogether, the fear of someone whose world has been destabilized by an act they did not perform, but which may nonetheless have profound consequences for their own future. Then you believe her innocent? I believe, Miss Marple corrected gently, that innocence and guilt are often far more complicated than they initially appear. Eleanor may be innocent of murder while still being guilty of something else entirely. Something that Victor discovered this morning, something that prompted their argument. Inspector Thornton nodded slowly, absorbing this observation. What of the others? Dorothy Ashworth is protecting someone, Miss Marple continued. Whether that someone is James Collingwood or one of her late husband's relatives, I cannot yet determine. James Collingwood himself is concealing financial irregularities of some sort. I observed his discomfort when any matter involving accounts was mentioned. And Margaret Ashworth. Miss Marple paused, choosing her words with characteristic precision. Margaret Ashworth is terrified of something, but whether that terror concerns her late husband's death or some other matter remains unclear. And the letter opener? Inspector Thornton asked. The murder weapon? Ah, Miss Marple said softly. The letter opener is significant precisely because it appears significant. Whoever used it as a weapon wanted the Ashworth connection to be immediately apparent, which suggests that either the killer wished to incriminate the Ashworth family, or the killer is themselves part of that family and chose to use a familiar weapon, believing it would provide a convenient cover of obviousness. Inspector Thornton rose, extending his hand to help Miss Marple to her feet. Thank you, Miss Marple. Your insights may prove invaluable. As she departed into the autumn darkness, Miss Marple reflected that the true investigation was only just beginning. The morning broke grey and cold over Thornfield, the autumn sun obscured by heavy clouds that promised rain before noon. Miss Marple had spent a restless night, her mind circling around the fragments of information she had collected like a cat circling a mouse hole, searching for the precise angle of entry. She rose at 6 o'clock, as was her custom, and prepared a modest breakfast of toast and tea while listening to the wireless. The BBC News made no mention of the murder. Such provincial tragedies rarely commanded national attention, but the absence of information only sharpened her focus on what remained unknown. By 8 o'clock, she had walked to the library, arriving just as Inspector Thornton's team was establishing their search perimeter. Constables were photographing the office, measuring distances, and examining every surface with methodical precision. Inspector Thornton himself stood near the display table where the marked Tennyson volume still rested, seemingly undisturbed overnight. Miss Marple, he greeted her with something approaching warmth. I was hoping you might return. I have a matter I wish to discuss with you privately. They moved to a corner of the reading room, away from the activity of the constables. Inspector Thornton lowered his voice, though the surrounding noise rendered such caution largely unnecessary. We have discovered something rather significant. The victim's wallet contained a letter, handwritten, relatively recent, from Eleanor Hartwell to her husband. It references a substantial sum of money and contains language that could be interpreted as threatening. May I see it? Miss Marple inquired. Inspector Thornton produced the letter, which Miss Marple examined with careful attention. The handwriting was indeed Eleanor's. She had seen samples of it in the library's donation records. The content was damning. Victor, you must reconsider. If you proceed with this plan, you will destroy everything I have worked for. I cannot allow you to do this. There are consequences you have not considered. Compelling evidence, Miss Marple acknowledged, returning the letter carefully. Yet I wonder about the timeline. When was this letter written? 3 days ago, Inspector Thornton replied. According to Eleanor's statement, she composed it in an attempt to dissuade Victor from some financial decision. She claims she placed it on his desk at their home, not expecting him to carry it with him. And did she say what financial decision she was attempting to dissuade him from? Inspector Thornton's expression darkened. This is where the matter becomes complicated. Eleanor claims that Victor had discovered irregularities in the library's accounts. She admits that she may have been overzealous in her management of certain funds. Nothing criminal, she insists, merely administrative oversights. But Victor threatened to report the matter to the library's board of trustees. Miss Marple considered this revelation. A motive, certainly, but not a particularly compelling one. Eleanor has been librarian for only 8 months. A reasonable explanation of accounting errors would likely have been accepted, particularly given her otherwise exemplary performance. Unless, Inspector Thornton suggested, there is more to these accounting irregularities than she has admitted. Before Miss Marple could respond, Sergeant Matthews approached, carrying a leather portfolio that had clearly been retrieved from Victor's office. "Inspector, you should see this. We found it in the filing cabinet." The portfolio contained financial documents, bank statements, investment records, and correspondence between Victor Hartwell and various business associates. What emerged from this collection was a pattern of systematic fraud spanning nearly 2 years. Victor had been embezzling funds from his employer's business accounts, siphoning money into offshore accounts established under false names. "This is remarkable," Inspector Thornton breathed, spreading the documents across one of the library tables. Victor Hartwell was not merely a banker. He was a criminal of considerable sophistication. Miss Marple studied the documents with growing interest. The dates were particularly significant. The fraudulent transactions began approximately 18 months ago, roughly 6 months before Eleanor Hartwell had arrived in Thornfield to assume her position as librarian. Certain transactions bore notations that appeared to be Eleanor's handwriting, or rather, handwriting that closely resembled Eleanor's. "I perceive a complication," Miss Marple said quietly. "These documents suggest that Eleanor may have been complicit in at least some portion of these financial irregularities." "Which would strengthen the motive for murder," Inspector Thornton concluded grimly. If Victor was threatening to expose not only Eleanor's administrative oversights, but also her involvement in his more serious crimes, she would have had considerable reason to silence him. Yet something troubled Miss Marple about this narrative. The pieces fit too neatly, the evidence arranged too conveniently. She moved to the display table and picked up the marked Tennyson volume, opening it once more to the underlined passage. In the margin of the night, the coldest words are written. "Inspector, I wonder if you have considered the possibility that these documents were deliberately placed where we would find them," she said thoughtfully. "The filing cabinet was not locked," you said. "Anyone with access to this office could have deposited them there." Inspector Thornton frowned. "You suggest the documents are planted evidence?" "I suggest," Miss Marple replied, "that someone wished very much for us to believe that Victor Hartwell was a criminal, and that Eleanor Hartwell had both motive and knowledge to commit murder. Whether that someone is correct in their assessment of Eleanor's guilt, or whether they are simply directing suspicion toward a convenient target, remains to be determined." At precisely that moment, a constable entered the library with urgent news. "Inspector, we have just received word from the bank. Victor Hartwell made a substantial withdrawal yesterday, £50,000 in cash. The bank manager says it was highly unusual. Victor specifically requested that no record of the transaction be maintained beyond the standard documentation." Inspector Thornton and Miss Marple exchanged glances. The case, which had appeared to be reaching a resolution, had suddenly become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The significance of Victor's cash withdrawal hung in the air like a thundercloud, threatening imminent storm. Inspector Thornton's face had taken on a grayish pallor, and Miss Marple observed that his fingers drummed against the table in a pattern that suggested rapid calculation. £50,000, he repeated slowly, "and he withdrew this sum yesterday morning." "According to the bank manager, yes," the constable confirmed. "The withdrawal was processed at approximately 9:30. Victor arrived with specific instructions and left with the money in a leather case. The manager found it rather suspicious at the time, but assumed it was a legitimate business transaction. "Where is this money now?" Inspector Thornton demanded. The constable shook his head. "The bank manager has no information regarding its destination. Victor did not explain the purpose of the withdrawal, and the bank protocols do not require such explanation for withdrawals of this magnitude by authorized account holders." Miss Marple set down the Tennyson volume with deliberate care. "This changes matters considerably. A man does not withdraw £50,000 in cash the day before his death unless he intends to use that money for something specific, something that cannot be traced through conventional banking channels." "Blackmail," Sergeant Matthews suggested eagerly. "Perhaps someone was blackmailing Victor over his embezzlement scheme. He withdrew the money to pay them off." "Possible," Miss Marple acknowledged. "Yet it raises a question. If Victor was being blackmailed and intended to pay the blackmailer, why would he bring those financial documents to the book fair? They remain incriminating evidence against himself." Inspector Thornton rose abruptly. "We need to speak with Eleanor again. If Victor was being blackmailed, she may have information regarding who held this leverage over him." But before the inspector could proceed, the library doors opened with considerable force. Dorothy Ashworth entered, followed closely by James Collingwood, and her expression suggested she had arrived with purpose rather than casual social visitation. Her face was flushed, and her substantial frame seemed to radiate barely controlled fury. "Inspector Thornton," she announced imperiously, "I have come to make a statement regarding matters that I should have revealed yesterday, but chose not to, out of misplaced loyalty and family concern." Inspector Thornton gestured toward the office. "Mrs. Ashworth, if you would step into my temporary interview space." "I prefer to speak here," Dorothy insisted, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to having her preferences respected, "where Miss Marple can hear as well. She strikes me as a woman who understands the truth, however uncomfortable, must ultimately prevail over social discretion." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously, though her mind was already racing through possibilities, recalibrating theories based on this unexpected development. Dorothy settled herself into a chair, with the deliberate movements of someone bracing for impact. "My late husband, Gerald Ashworth, was not a good man. I say this not from hatred, but from simple fact. He was charming, certainly. Financially successful, undoubtedly. But he was also a man who took what he wanted without regard for consequence or morality." James Collingwood shifted uncomfortably beside her, his expression suggesting that he knew what was coming and wished very much that it were not. 3 years ago," Dorothy continued, "Gerald became involved in a financial scheme with Victor Hartwell. They had attended school together, you understand, and maintained a connection over the decades. Victor approached Gerald with a proposition, an investment opportunity that promised extraordinary returns. Gerald, being the sort of man who was perpetually convinced that he could outsmart the world, agreed to participate." "What manner of investment?" Inspector Thornton asked, his notebook already open. "Illegal speculation in futures markets," Dorothy said bluntly. "Foreign currency exchanges involving shell companies and false documentation. I do not claim to understand the details. Such matters hold no interest for me. But I know enough to recognize that it was fraudulent. And I know that my husband invested nearly £200,000 into this scheme." A muscle tightened in James Collingwood's jaw. His hand moved toward Dorothy's arm, a gesture that might have been protective or cautionary. "What happened to this investment?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "It collapsed," Dorothy said. 3 years ago this November. Gerald lost everything, not merely the £200,000 he had invested, but also his reputation, his standing in the financial community, and ultimately his will to live. He took his own life 18 months later using pills and whiskey in the conservatory at Ashworth Manor. The library fell into profound silence. Even the constables, who had continued their methodical work in the background, seemed to pause in recognition of the gravity of Dorothy's revelation. "And you believe Victor Hartwell was responsible for Gerald's death?" Inspector Thornton asked carefully. I know he was responsible, Dorothy replied with absolute certainty. Victor perpetrated the fraud deliberately. He knew the scheme would fail. He knew Gerald would lose everything. He deliberately targeted my husband because Gerald had something Victor had always coveted. A prestigious name, inherited wealth, social standing that could not be purchased. Victor destroyed Gerald deliberately, and when Gerald could no longer endure the shame and financial ruin, he took his own life. But this occurred 3 years ago, Sergeant Matthews protested. Why would you kill Victor now after so long a time? I did not kill Victor, Dorothy said coldly. But I can tell you who did and why, and I can explain precisely how the murder was planned and executed. She turned to face James Collingwood directly, and in that moment the solicitor's carefully maintained facade crumbled entirely. His face flushed crimson, and his hands trembled as they gripped the arms of his chair. James, Dorothy said, her voice containing both pity and contempt, was Gerald's closest friend. They had been companions since childhood. James was also the executor of Gerald's estate and the inheritor of certain documents that Gerald left behind. Documents detailing Victor's scheme, along with instructions regarding what James was to do with them should anything unfortunate occur. Miss Marple felt a profound clarity settle over her mind as the final pieces of the puzzle began to align. James Collingwood rose from his chair with the jerky movements of a puppet controlled by unseen hands. His face had transformed from controlled composure to something raw and desperate, the accumulated weight of 18 months of concealed knowledge finally becoming unbearable. He opened his mouth as though to speak, closed it again, then moved toward the library's tall windows as though seeking escape through the very glass. Sit down, Mr. Collingwood, Inspector Thornton commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Sergeant Matthews positioned himself between Collingwood and the nearest exit, though the solicitor made no genuine attempt to flee. I didn't kill him, Collingwood said, the words emerging hoarsely. You must understand, I didn't kill him, but I knew who would. I knew, and I allowed it to happen. Dorothy Ashworth's expression remained impassive, though Miss Marple detected the faintest tremor in her clasped hands. This was a moment Dorothy had anticipated, but not welcomed, the inevitable exposure of secrets that had been buried alongside her husband's ashes. Explain yourself, Inspector Thornton demanded. Collingwood sank back into his chair, his body seeming to lose structural integrity. Gerald wrote me a letter before he died. Not a suicide note in the conventional sense, but something far more deliberate. He detailed Victor's fraud meticulously. He named the financial institutions involved, the shell companies, the false documentation. He explained how Victor had deliberately targeted him, how Victor had manipulated him into believing the investment was legitimate when Victor himself knew it was fundamentally corrupt. And Gerald instructed you to do what with this information? Miss Marple asked gently. He told me to hold it, to keep it safe, and he wrote specific instructions. If Victor ever prospered from his crimes, if he ever escaped justice through legal channels or simple chance, then I was to ensure that consequences found him. He didn't specify how. He left that to my discretion and my conscience. Inspector Thornton leaned forward. Are you confessing to murder, Mr. Collingwood? No, Collingwood said firmly. I'm confessing to knowing that murder would occur and to deliberately positioning myself to allow it to happen. But I did not strike the blow. I did not kill Victor Hartwell. The library door opened abruptly, and Eleanor Hartwell entered, accompanied by a constable who appeared confused by her sudden arrival. Eleanor's face was streaked with tears, and her composure had been abandoned entirely. She moved directly toward Miss Marple, bypassing Inspector Thornton and Sergeant Matthews as though they were merely furniture. It was me, Eleanor said, her voice barely audible. I killed him. I did it because Mr. Collingwood came to me and explained everything. He explained that Victor was a criminal who had destroyed an innocent man, and he asked me if I could live with that knowledge. if I could allow Victor to continue his deception and his cruelty indefinitely. "Eleanor, you mustn't," Collingwood began, but she silenced him with an upraised hand. "I was terrified," Eleanor continued, addressing Miss Marple rather than the police inspector. "When I discovered the accounting irregularities, I realized Victor had been using the library's accounts as a conduit for laundering money. Small amounts, carefully distributed, easily explained away as administrative errors. When I confronted him, he didn't even attempt to deny it. He simply told me that the library's accounts would remain compromised unless I remained silent, and that if I ever spoke to anyone about what I had discovered, he would ensure that I was blamed for the entire scheme." "So you killed him to protect yourself," Sergeant Matthews concluded. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I killed him because James Collingwood showed me Gerald Ashworth's letter. Because I realized that Victor was a man who destroyed people methodically and without remorse, and because James made me understand that sometimes ordinary justice is insufficient. Sometimes the guilty escape the law through their own cunning, and someone must intervene." Miss Marple felt a profound sadness settle over her as the final truth crystallized. She had suspected Eleanor's involvement from the beginning, but not for these reasons. She had assumed guilt born of self-interest. Instead, what she witnessed was guilt born of something far more complicated. A terrible clarity regarding human evil, coupled with a misguided belief that violence could serve as corrective. "Where is the £50,000? Inspector Thornton asked, his tone suggesting that he had already begun to understand the answer. "I have it," Eleanor said. "Victor withdrew it yesterday morning. He told me it was payment for my silence, my continued cooperation in his money laundering scheme. He gave it to me, and then he told me that this was merely the beginning. He said he intended to expand his operations, to use the library as the foundation for something far larger and more sophisticated." "And you killed him because he attempted to expand his criminal enterprise," Collingwood said, completing the narrative. "Not because of what he had already done, but because of what he intended to do." Inspector Thornton moved toward Eleanor with the deliberate movements of a man performing a deeply distasteful duty. "Eleanor Hartwell, I must inform you of your rights regarding this confession." But before he could proceed, Miss Marple rose to her feet. Her movement commanded attention through its very deliberation. She regarded Eleanor with an expression of such profound compassion that even Inspector Thornton paused in his official procedures. "Miss Hartwell," Miss Marple said softly, "you have confessed to committing murder based upon information provided by Mr. Collingwood. But I wonder if you have considered whether Mr. Collingwood's information was entirely accurate. I wonder if you have thought to verify the contents of Mr. Ashworth's letter independently. And I wonder most of all whether you have considered that you may have been manipulated by a man far more dangerous than you have yet realized." Eleanor's face crumpled. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Miss Marple continued, "that a solicitor does not casually confess to knowledge of premeditated murder unless he believes that admission will protect him from more serious consequences. And I believe, Miss Hartwell, that you have just confessed to a crime you did not commit." The library seemed to hold its collective breath. Inspector Thornton's hand, which had been moving toward Eleanor's arm, froze midway. Sergeant Matthews looked between Miss Marple and Eleanor with the expression of someone watching a chess match between players of vastly different skill levels. James Collingwood's face had gone absolutely white, and beads of perspiration formed on his forehead with remarkable rapidity. "Miss Marple," Inspector Thornton said carefully, "I believe you should explain your meaning more fully." Miss Marple moved to one of the library chairs and settled herself with deliberate slowness, gesturing for Eleanor to do the same. The younger woman, sensing that she was being offered a reprieve from immediate arrest, sat down with trembling limbs. "I've spent the morning observing several curious facts," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but carrying absolute clarity. "The letter opener that served as the murder weapon belonged to the Ashworth collection. The financial documents implicating Eleanor were placed in Victor's office for us to discover. The £50,000 withdrawal occurred at a precise moment when Eleanor would become aware of it, yesterday morning when Victor arrived at their home in a state of agitation. She paused, allowing her observations to settle into the room's consciousness. "But what troubles me most," Miss Marple continued, "is the marked Tennyson volume. Someone deliberately underlined a specific passage. In the margin of the night, the coldest words are written. This is not the action of a spontaneous murderer. This is the action of someone attempting to communicate a message, and I suspect that message was directed not toward the police, but toward someone else entirely." Dorothy Ashworth had risen from her seat, her substantial frame suddenly appearing diminished, as though the weight of understanding was physically pressing her downward. Her eyes fixed upon James Collingwood with an expression of profound betrayal. "James," she said, her voice containing notes of devastating clarity, "you didn't come to me yesterday morning out of sudden conscience. You came because you had already planned this. You orchestrated everything." Collingwood attempted to rise, but Sergeant Matthews moved to block his path. The solicitor's composure, which had been fragmenting throughout this exchange, suddenly shattered entirely. He lunged toward the library windows, apparently intending to force his way through the glass, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him as effectively as physical restraint. "Mr. Collingwood," she said, "you discovered that Gerald's letter detailed not only Victor's fraud, but also your own involvement in that fraud. You were not merely Gerald's friend and executor. You were his partner in the scheme. When it collapsed, you were equally implicated, equally guilty. But unlike Gerald, you survived by maintaining silence and burying your complicity beneath layers of respectability and legal expertise." Collingwood sank back into his chair, all resistance evaporating. "When Victor began to expand his money-laundering operations," Miss Marple continued, "he needed a new layer of legal cover. He approached you not as a criminal, but as a solicitor offering you lucrative legal fees. You became aware, through this association, that Victor possessed documentation that could implicate you in the original fraud. Documentation that Gerald had provided to Victor as insurance against betrayal. That's not," Collingwood began, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "You recognize that Victor was becoming a liability. He knew too much about your involvement in Gerald's scheme. So you conceived a plan. You would eliminate Victor, but you would do so in a manner that would direct suspicion away from yourself. You identified Eleanor as the perfect instrument. A woman newly arrived in the village with financial irregularities in her accounts, with a troubled marriage, with a husband who possessed damaging information regarding her administrative oversights." Eleanor stared at Collingwood with dawning horror. "You told me that Victor had destroyed a good man. You said, 'I told you precisely what I needed you to believe,'" Collingwood said, his voice now devoid of all pretense. "Yes, Gerald was destroyed by Victor's fraud. But I was equally destroyed, equally desperate. I have spent 18 years maintaining a facade of respectability, terrified that the truth would emerge. And then Victor began his expansion, began consolidating his power, and I realized that my secret was no longer safe." "So you manipulated Eleanor into killing him," Inspector Thornton said flatly. "I placed Eleanor in a position where she would perceive Victor as an evil that required elimination," Collingwood replied, his tone almost conversational, as though discussing abstract philosophy rather than premeditated murder. "I showed her Gerald's letter. I explained Victor's crimes, all of which were true, by the way. I simply failed to mention my own involvement. I allowed Eleanor to believe she was performing a moral service by removing a dangerous criminal from society." "But I confessed," Eleanor whispered. "I just confessed to murdering him." "A confession made under duress and emotional manipulation," Miss Marple said gently. "A confession that Mr. Collingwood anticipated and which he clearly intended to support in court as a sincere statement of guilt. However, I suspect that when the actual evidence is examined more carefully, we will discover that Miss Hartwell did not, in fact, commit this crime." Inspector Thornton looked toward Miss Marple expectantly. Then who did murder Victor Hartwell? Mr. Collingwood himself, Miss Marple replied. He arrived at the library early yesterday morning during the setup. He possessed a key to the office, provided to him by Eleanor, or obtained through his connections with the Ashworth family. He placed the incriminating financial documents in Victor's filing cabinet. He placed the marked Tennyson volume on the display table as his own cryptic message, and when Victor arrived at approximately 2 o'clock, drawn to the library by a message that Mr. Collingwood had arranged to be sent, he struck with the letter opener that he had ensured Eleanor would recognize. But Eleanor said, Sergeant Matthews began. Eleanor said what she believed to be true, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Mr. Collingwood is a skilled manipulator of human emotion and perception. He convinced her that she was guilty, that her revulsion toward Victor's crimes had somehow translated into murderous action. In her distressed state, she accepted this narrative. But the physical evidence will tell a different story. Dorothy Ashworth, her face pale with realization, moved toward the door. I must contact my solicitor, a different solicitor, one who is not a murderer. As Sergeant Matthews moved toward Collingwood with restraints, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals were not those who acted from simple passion or obvious greed, but those who possessed the intelligence to manipulate others into serving their purposes, while remaining convinced of their own moral righteousness. The forensic examination that followed over the next several hours revealed details that corroborated Miss Marple's analysis with remarkable precision. Fingerprints lifted from the letter opener matched James Collingwood's, not Eleanor's. Fibers from Collingwood's jacket were discovered on the weapon's handle, indicating the force and angle at which it had been wielded. Most damning of all, the constables discovered in Collingwood's briefcase a detailed plan, sketched out in his own meticulous handwriting, documenting precisely how the murder was to be executed and how suspicion would be directed toward Eleanor. The plan was clinical in its precision. Every contingency had been considered. Every possible complication had been anticipated and addressed. It read less like the notes of a desperate man and more like the strategic documentation of a chess grandmaster planning an elaborate endgame. Miss Marple found herself profoundly disturbed by the cold rationality of it all. Eleanor had been released from custody by mid-afternoon, though the trauma of her false confession and the realization of her manipulation had left her in a state of emotional devastation. She sat in the library's reading room, wrapped in a blanket that Mrs. Bennet had provided, drinking tea that had grown cold in her hands. Dr. Chapman sat beside her, his presence clearly offering more comfort than his words, which were limited to occasional expressions of sympathy and professional concern. Inspector Thornton approached Miss Marple as she stood near the window, observing the grey autumn afternoon that had finally begun to deliver on its promise of rain. Drops fell against the glass with melancholic persistence. Miss Marple, the inspector said, I find myself curious about several aspects of your deduction. How did you perceive that Mr. Collingwood was the true perpetrator? The evidence against Eleanor seemed quite compelling. Evidence can be made to seem compelling when it is deliberately arranged by someone with legal expertise and intimate knowledge of investigative procedures, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Mr. Collingwood knew precisely what would appear incriminating and precisely how to ensure that such evidence would be discovered by your team. But that does not explain your certainty, Inspector Thornton persisted. Surely you entertained the possibility that Eleanor was guilty. Of course I did, Miss Marple acknowledged, but I considered the nature of guilt itself. The question was not whether Eleanor harbored resentment toward her husband or whether she possessed motive. The question was whether she possessed the particular variety of psychological detachment required to commit premeditated murder while maintaining her composure through questioning and false confession. She turned to face the inspector directly. Eleanor is a woman of principle, albeit occasionally misguided principle. When confronted with evidence of her own guilt, she accepted that guilt because her moral framework demanded accountability. But a true murderer, particularly one as calculated as James Collingwood, would have fought the accusation far more vigorously. He would have demanded evidence, protested injustice, constructed alternative narratives. Instead, Collingwood essentially admitted his knowledge of the crime while attempting to frame Eleanor as the actual perpetrator. That admission, however disguised in language of confession and regret, was in itself highly suspicious. Inspector Thornton nodded slowly. "Your reasoning is sound." "And the marked Tennyson passage?" "A communication," Miss Marple explained. Mr. Collingwood left it for someone specific, likely himself, actually. A reminder of his emotional state as he prepared to commit murder. In the margin of the night, the coldest words are written. He was documenting that this murder, this particular act of violence, represented the coldest and most calculated decision of his life. It was his way of acknowledging the moral chasm he was crossing. "A very literary murderer," Inspector Thornton observed dryly. "All murderers are literary in their own way," Miss Marple said gently. "They compose narratives to justify their actions. They construct meaning around their crimes. Mr. Collingwood simply possessed greater sophistication in articulating that narrative than most." As the afternoon progressed, a picture emerged of James Collingwood's life that was profoundly tragic in its own fashion. He had been a man of genuine talent and intelligence, corrupted early by association with Gerald Ashworth's greed and by his own youthful belief that he could outsmart the systems that governed financial markets. When the scheme collapsed, he had spent 18 years in a prison of his own making, not locked behind bars, but confined within layers of fabricated respectability and constant terror of exposure. Victor Hartwell's expansion of his criminal operations had represented to Collingwood the final threat to his carefully constructed facade. Rather than face the exposure that seemed inevitable, Collingwood had chosen violence as his solution. He had convinced himself that eliminating Victor would restore equilibrium to his life, that the removal of this one dangerous liability would allow him to return to his comfortable existence. It was a delusion born of desperation and enabled by 18 years of successful deception. By evening, as the rain intensified and the library's windows reflected the muted glow of electric light against the darkness outside, Eleanor Hartwell finally spoke at length. She sat with Miss Marple in a quiet corner, her earlier devastation having transformed into something more like numb resignation. "I could have been hanged," Eleanor said quietly. "If I had truly killed Victor, I would have confessed anyway. I would have accepted that consequence. Because in that moment, after James showed me Gerald's letter, after he explained what Victor had done, I genuinely believed it was right. I believed that removing Victor from the world was a moral act." "That is precisely why Mr. Collingwood selected you," Miss Marple replied gently. "He recognized that you possessed a moral framework that could be manipulated. He exploited your capacity for righteous conviction, knowing that you would ultimately accept responsibility for an action you did not perform. He was, in the final analysis, a profound student of human psychology." Eleanor closed her eyes. "What happens to me now?" "You return to your life," Miss Marple said, "though it will be a different life than the one you possessed before yesterday. You have learned something about the nature of manipulation, about the importance of questioning the narratives others construct for our acceptance. That is, perhaps, the most valuable education one can receive, however painfully acquired." The trial of James Collingwood concluded on a grey November morning, precisely 4 weeks after Victor Hartwell's death. The proceedings had generated considerable attention in the regional press, though the national newspapers had largely ignored what they deemed a provincial matter of limited significance. Miss Marple attended the final day of testimony, sitting in the gallery with the composed demeanor of someone observing a theatrical production, whose outcome she had already determined months in advance. Collingwood was convicted on charges of premeditated murder. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. His own detailed plans, discovered in his briefcase, served as a confession more damning than any words he could have spoken. The defense attempted to argue temporary insanity brought on by accumulated trauma and fear, but the calculated nature of the crime, the deliberate manipulation of Eleanor, the careful placement of false evidence, the strategic use of the letter opener from the Ashworth collection, all suggested a mind operating with perfect clarity and sophisticated intent. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. As Collingwood was led away from the courtroom, his face remained impassive, though Miss Marple detected the subtle trembling in his hands that betrayed the profound shock of facing consequences he had somehow convinced himself would never manifest. Thornfield gradually returned to its ordinary rhythms, though the village was forever altered by the violence that had erupted within its peaceful confines. The library reopened after a week of closure, and Eleanor Hartwell resumed her position as head librarian with a quiet determination that earned her unexpected respect from the community. The scandal that might have destroyed her instead seemed to have earned her a measure of sympathy and recognition. Her integrity in accepting the initial accusations, her refusal to simply blame Collingwood when she might have done so, and her genuine remorse regarding her susceptibility to manipulation all contributed to a public narrative of redemption rather than guilt. Victor Hartwell's criminal operations were gradually dismantled by financial investigators and police from multiple jurisdictions. The money he had stolen, both from his employer and from the elaborate Ponzi schemes he had orchestrated, was partially recovered and distributed to victims. Dorothy Ashworth was discovered to have been one of those victims, her late husband's investment having been far more deeply compromised than she had initially understood. The additional financial burden this revelation imposed upon her was substantial, yet she bore it with stoic acceptance that Miss Marple found admirable. Dorothy and Miss Marple developed an unexpected friendship in the month that followed. They would take tea together on Thursday afternoons in Dorothy's drawing room at Ashworth Manor, discussing literature, human nature, and the peculiar ways that trauma sometimes revealed character rather than obscuring it. Dorothy spoke openly of her suspicions regarding Collingwood's true role in the crime, and how she had come to understand that her own misplaced loyalty toward the memory of James's friendship with Gerald had nearly allowed a murderer to escape justice. "I should have recognized it," Dorothy said one afternoon, as rain pattered against the manor's tall windows. "When James came to me with his revelation about Gerald's letter, I should have questioned his motivation more carefully. Instead, I chose to believe that he was acting from righteous principle, when in fact he was performing the final move in a game of calculated deception." "We see what we wish to see," Miss Marple replied gently. "Particularly when that person has presented themselves to us over many years as trustworthy. Mr. Collingwood understood the value of long-term investment in creating a false persona. He had spent 18 years building credibility, and that credibility became his most effective tool." Eleanor and Miss Marple also maintained regular contact. Eleanor had determined that she would remain as librarian in Thornfield, but her perspective on her role had fundamentally shifted. She began an initiative to preserve local historical documents and records, creating what would eventually become one of the finest village archives in the region. In her work, she seemed to have found both redemption and purpose, a way of transforming her experience of betrayal into something constructive and lasting. 3 months after Collingwood's imprisonment, Miss Marple received a letter from Dr. Chapman. He had taken a position at a larger hospital in London, but had maintained his connection to Thornfield through regular visits. The letter mentioned, in carefully neutral language, that Eleanor had accepted his invitation to dinner during his most recent visit to the village, and that he hoped to establish a more permanent arrangement with her in the coming months. Miss Marple smiled as she read this news, recognizing in the doctor's cautious optimism a proper understanding of Eleanor's fragile emotional state and a genuine care for her well-being. One final autumn afternoon, exactly 1 year after Victor Hartwell's death, Miss Marple returned to St. Mary's Library. Eleanor was cataloguing a new donation, and she looked up with genuine warmth when Miss Marple entered. "I have something to show you," Eleanor said, leading Miss Marple to a display case near the entrance. Inside, arranged carefully under glass, was the Tennyson collection. The volume with the underlined passage was positioned at the center, and beneath it was a small placard that read, "Given to St. Mary's Library in memory of Gerald Ashworth, 1923 to 1977. A reminder that in the margin of the night, the coldest words are written, but the warmest words are those spoken in truth." Miss Marple regarded the display with quiet satisfaction. Eleanor had transformed Collingwood's cryptic message into something redemptive, a meditation on truth and consequence that would serve future visitors as both warning and wisdom. It was precisely the sort of profound reframing that characterized the human capacity for recovery and growth. "It is beautiful," Miss Marple said simply, "a fitting monument to both the tragedy that occurred and the community's determination to move beyond it." As she departed the library into the pale autumn sunlight, Miss Marple reflected that perhaps this was the true resolution of any mystery. Not merely the identification of the guilty party, but the transformation of suffering into understanding, and of understanding into something approaching wisdom. Victor Hartwell had been a man of considerable talent, corrupted by greed. James Collingwood had been a man of genuine intelligence, destroyed by fear and shame. And Eleanor Hartwell had been a woman of principle, nearly destroyed by her own moral susceptibility. In understanding each of them, Thornfield had learned something essential about the human condition itself: that evil rarely announces itself openly, that good intentions can mask terrible deceptions, and that redemption, however difficult, remains always possible for those with courage to pursue it.